How's everyone doing? Good? Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Aria, Aber, and Leslie Jamison with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Aria's debut novel, Good Girl. But before we get officially started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Aria will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Good Girl online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now let's get into this. The fact that there are blurbs from Aber and Raven Leilani on the cover should tell you everything you need to know about this book, and that it is very well worth your while, but it really is one of the sharpest debuts to hit our bookshelves. Through the eyes of the young protagonist Nila, a daughter of Afghan immigrants living in Berlin, Good Girl explores the complexities of community and companionship, self-perception and self-realization, and so much more. And thankfully, we have two very, very smart writers to discuss all of that tonight. Aria Aber was born and raised in Germany and now lives here in the United States. Her debut poetry collection, Heart Damage, won the Prairie Schooner Book Prize and the Whiting Award. Her writing has appeared in the New Yorker, New Republic, the Yale Review, Granta, and elsewhere. She recently joined the creative writing faculty of the University of Vermont and divides her time between Vermont and Brooklyn. As I said before, Good Girl is her debut novel. And Leslie Jamison joins Aria in conversation tonight. Leslie is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Splinters, The Recovering, and The Empathy Exams, the collection of essays Make It Scream, Make It Burn, and the novel The Gin Closet. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and currently teaches at Columbia and lives here in Brooklyn. That's all for me. Please join me in giving Aria and Leslie a very warm welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. First of all, thank you, Books Are Magic, for hosting this. I love you, indie booksellers. This means a lot to me. And thank you to David and Aaron and Jalen and everyone at Hogarth. And thank you to Bill and everyone at the Clegg Agency for supporting me. I wouldn't be here without you, so it means a lot. And thank you, Leslie, for doing this.
Oh, such a thrill and a pleasure and an honor. I'm so excited. I love this book so much, and I can't wait to talk about it with you.
Thank you. I guess I'll start by reading the first page and a half of the book so you can get in the mood. The train back to Berlin took 7 hours, and the towel in my suitcase was still wet from my last swim in the lake, dampening the pages of my favorite books. I took the S-Bahn and then the U-Bahn home to Lipschitzallee and walked past the discount supermarket, the old pharmacy, and the Qurbani bakery with the orange shop cat lounging outside its door. In our building's elevator, an intimate odor assaulted my nostrils. Urine mixed with ash. "Hello, spider," I said, looking at the cobweb in the corner. The ceiling lamp twitched, turning alien the swastika graffiti. My key, fastened by a pink ribbon, turned in the old lock. Nobody was home. I kicked off my shoes. The cat meowed for food, its dander floating in the air. My room was merely all it had been for so many years. A suffocating box with a tiny window, pink sheets, and that Goethe quote I'd painted in golden letters above my desk. The popcorn ceiling seemed lower than before. I wiped the kitchen counters, walked into my parents' bedroom, opened their closet, and pulled out my mother's cashmere frock. Maybe I cried, maybe I didn't. What I did was lie in bed and sleep until dark, covering my face with her dress. It's been over a decade now, but the colors of that summer day are as precise as yesterday. I was 18 when I returned from boarding school, and my sense of melancholy was even more overwhelming than I anticipated. My cousins called me pretentious. The Arab boys who loitered outside the shisha bar sneered at me. You changed, they said, meaning my relative lack of vernacular and my newfound obsession with eyeliner. Back then, I still wanted to be a photographer, a small Olympus point-and-shoot knocking around in my backpack. In my first days back, Berlin bloomed at the seams with rotten garbage. Ants crawled out of the sockets in my father's living room, a small street of them always leading up the wall and out the window, no matter how much poison we sprayed into the electrical outlets or taped them shut. They just returned. And though prophesied to soon be extinct, the bees were also everywhere. They covered the overflowing trash cans in the city, or you'd see them lazily dozing on outdoor cafe tables, where they fattened themselves on crumbs of sugar or lay unconscious next to jars of cherry jam. I brushed the dirt out of my hair and rinsed it from my face, and all I could hear, even in the early morning, was the howling of sirens over the frenzied songs of birds which chirped and chirped and chirped. In August, I enrolled at Humboldt-Universität for philosophy and art history, not because I wanted to study, but because I wanted the free U-Bahn pass. And so I let the glittery, destructive underworld of Berlin sink its fangs into me, my solitude alleviated only when I went out at night and got lost in some apartment with tattooed men and women who did poppers underneath a framed picture of Ulrike Meinhof. Then I went home, my nose bleeding, my hair smelling of cigarette smoke, and was confronted by that disappointed look on my father's face, my grandmother's suspended in a perpetual frown. I had been lifted out of the low-income district of hopelessness and sent to one of the best schools in the country, and yet here I was. My mother was dead. Soon the city would be covered in snow again, and I was ravaged by the hunger to ruin my life.
Aria, it truly is. It's just thrilling, really, to have the chance to talk to you a little bit about this book and to hear you read from it. When we were talking in the back, and you said you were going to read the first few paragraphs, I said, "Oh, good. I actually have two questions that are specifically about the first two paragraphs, but now I actually realize I have three. So this was really the right way to begin." And I thought, I was so struck by the last line that you read, and I thought we could begin there. When Nila says, "I was ravaged by the hunger to ruin my own life," I appreciate so much about actually the interesting syntax of that sentence too, because it associates self-destruction with a kind of an appetite, something acquisitional. To be ravaged by hunger is to be sort of destroyed, but also enlarging the self at the same time. And I thought maybe as a way into talking about the book, as a way into thinking about Nila and where this book takes her, the journey that it tracks her on, you could just talk a little bit maybe about the relationship between self-knowledge and self-destruction in this book. How is a sort of appetite for self-destruction a way into certain kinds of knowledge for Nila? Where does it take her?
I love that question. And a little background, obviously Nila is Afghan-German. She's a 19-year-old or 18-year-old at the beginning, but turns 19-year-old early on in the novel. And I wanted her to combine the kind of dialectical tension between self-destruction and self-fulfillment. And I love that you pointed to that sentence because it includes the philosophy, syntactically even. And I think she's driven by two opposite catalysts. One of them is desire, eros, the life force, and the other one is really a desire to destroy herself, or a death drive, which manifests in a sense of shame, I think, within her. Ultimately, the way out for her is through art and photography and finding her own vision, but these two opposing catalysts are in tandem and work pretty hardcore in the novel, I would say. Especially her appetite for self-destruction or desire leads her down a path of excess and filth and drugs and sexual experimentation, I think. But shame ultimately, even though she tries to outrun it at every corner, eventually catches up with her and leads to a sense of withdrawal and isolation and self-hatred, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the role of shame and shamelessness and how those two forces kind of entwine. And I have a question about that a little bit later that's also connected to a moment I love in one of your poems. But I thought, since you spoke also about her relationship to art and to photography and that ultimately becomes the kind of way through or out, or a way to even make something from those competing drives that you were talking about. I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about this novel as a response to the tradition of the Künstlerroman, the kind of coming of age of the artist, and how you see all of these different threads of Nila's life and experience, her life as the child of Afghan immigrants, her vexed relationship to home, her relationship to institutional privilege and all these like texts she's absorbed at her fancy boarding school, her relationship to self-destruction, her relationship to her older lover and her crew of friends, her relationship to the clubs of Berlin. Like, how are all of these things, her intense observational eye that we could really see and hear in those first couple paragraphs, like how are all of those kind of part of this story of her coming of age as an artist and finding a kind of vision?
I think I was really interested in writing a Bildungsroman primarily because I love when a character in a novel or in a story or even in a poem experiences a sense of change that they cannot come back from. An inevitable moment where maybe a knowledge that they feared, or at least this is true for Nila, a knowledge that she has feared, is proven to be true. And obviously the most universal time that happens is when we are at the precipice of adulthood, when we leave childhood and youth. So that's why the Bildungsroman came up. And then, of course, she's an artist, which is also a development that goes through the same motions of like recognizing your talent, harnessing it, developing a craft, finding all kinds of boundaries against which you bristle and grow. And everything comes in together, all these different threads that you just mentioned come together in the form of photography. And I think there were a couple of different art forms that she could have chosen, and I chose photography because I'm really interested in visual art and how static it is, unlike writing, and photography in particular because I find it very hard to write about, so it was kind of an interesting challenge. And there was one text by Walter Benjamin about the early history of photography that I found extremely compelling when I was writing the first drafts of this book, wherein he talks about the earliest photographs before it became industrialized and so commercial and ubiquitous. And there's a portrait that he describes by the Russian photographer Dauthendy. It's a portrait of him and his wife, and the wife looks down. She kind of evades the gaze of the camera. But the husband, the photographer who has staged this, is looking straight at the camera. And 6 months later, or a year later, I think, he will find that his wife has committed suicide. And Walter Benjamin goes on to discuss whether or not this photograph maybe has a little bit of the future already contained within it, even though neither the subject nor the person who photographed it was aware of it. So kind of like a Freudian slip, so to say, within a picture. And I'm interested when that happens in art But photography specifically has a kind of pseudo-objectivity within the medium that you don't have in writing, because it can be a testament, it can be a document that is used in court. So I was interested in that, and I think Nila is also interested in that. And then, of course, photography for a person in exile creates a kind of archive that she doesn't have access to, proof and evidence that she is on Earth. And I think the third reason why photography is so important is because she's so aware of everyone's gaze and expectation. And eventually, her most successful photographs are self-portraits, because she doesn't have to adhere to anyone else's eye or gaze during those moments. And I think it was the perfect medium for her. Yeah.
Well, two questions, just thinking about everything you just said, which is so interesting. And the first is maybe about how, thinking about Nila as somebody who ultimately finds an artistic sense of self in the medium of photography, and a visual medium, and a medium that's about the gaze. I wonder how you also thought about building her character through her often intensely visual gaze in the text. Like, I'm thinking about even the passages we heard aloud where we're kind of getting to know her through what she sees, the ants, the bees, the look of the streets, the look of her neighborhood. How did you sort of approach her visual gaze as a way to kind of build her as a character in the text, alongside her relationships and interactions with other characters, alongside her sort of plot arc and trajectory?
I love that question. I think part of it is subconscious, because I, as a writer, am a very visual writer and interested in details, but also because I wanted to create a world that feels alive and like throbbing almost. And Berlin as a city, which is where most of the novel takes place, to me feels like a very messy, ugly, and unruly place. And I wanted to bring some of the pulse of the city into the book and into the writing. But I also think that she's finely attuned to all kinds of information and rooms and places that she goes into, because of her class positionality as a poor person who has been sent to a fancy boarding school, so is aware of the change in rooms. And also as a person who grows up in kind of like government subsidized prefab brutalist housing, but lives in a place that's historic and European and has a lot of like beautiful pre-war architecture. She's an aesthete, she yearns for beauty, so she sees everything that is not beautiful, it's almost like a sore in her eye, and she has to record it.
Yeah, there's a way that it just that way brings the eyes of an outsider to every world she inhabits, whether it's like the sort of worlds of beauty or privilege that she's coming to as a kind of class outsider, or the ways in which she then sort of brings that double consciousness back home. And there's a way that when she describes her home environment, she's almost describing it through the hypothetical eyes of somebody from outside of that world, what they would see, what would look filthy or dirty or shame, her sort of, the gaze of her shame in that way is like invoking the other from the world of privilege.
Exactly.
And what would they see? Well, there's so much about the physicality and specificity of how you build this like unruly, throbbing city and its spaces, that just immediately compelled me. As I think I told you right after I read the book, I read it in a big, in a kind of a single inhalation, and was like utterly under its spell and in its world. And I was thinking about, the even just the physicality of the very first sentence, this detail that I love, the wet towel dampening the pages of my favorite books, and that train ride back to Berlin. And it seems to me that even that contained phrase, the wet towel dampening the pages of the books, is a bit of a manifesto for the mode of the book, how visceral it is, that idea of visceral experience sort of dampening the literary text, right? And I wonder for you how kind of sensory details and attunement to just the deeply embodied experience of Nila on the page, what aspects of her character that kind of allows you to bring forth? Like, what is all the physicality of this book? How does it kind of take you deeper into the emotional tensions just in the act of writing?
I love that question so much. I think part of the reason why sensory detail or embodiment, as you call it, are important in this book in particular is because she's, first of all, a very young person. Second, she's on drugs all the time, which is a very visceral experience physically. I mean, oftentimes it's also quite numbing, and you might not remember, but I think I wanted to bring part of the intensity or like heightened intensity of consciousness and also physical consciousness or awareness into the text. But then she's also driven by a very intense emotion, which is anger and self-hatred, which can be quite activating physically and manifest somatically, I think. So the body and place and bringing that into the language of the text was extremely important to me, because so much of what happens or what I'm describing within the text is also physical action, be it like sexual encounters or dancing in a club and having like intense experiences in either winter or in summer. And I think partly I was also just interested in these intense weather experiences or intense physical experiences because I started writing this book in early 2020 during the pandemic, when the body just seemed like a precarious site, but also being a body within like a public or cosmopolitan place seemed heightened to some extent. So I think part of it was just absorbing the environment that I was in while I was writing it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about this novel emerging from, I mean, so many things, but among them that like temporal context of the early pandemic, because there are so many powerful scenes of bodies thrust together in these public spaces, whether it's public transport or the club you call the bunker. And yeah, I think just listening to you talk about the rhythms of certain kinds of alternation or contrast, whether it's winter and summer or the kind of intense like day and night rhythms of this novel, which definitely when I think about this novel, maybe 6 or 8 months after having read it for the first time, one of the things that has stayed with me most powerfully is that constant threshold crossing back and forth between these intense nights, right? Like the all night in the club or the night in the like lover's apartment, and then these really profound kind of morning after scenes. I mean, some of the most important photographs she takes are morning after photographs, and there's a kind of quality of exposing light, like the light of the morning after, that's often very uncomfortable but feels important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you sort of use those different sorts of contrasts, whether it's like what emerges in the winter and what emerges in the summer, or what emerges in these like intense, throbbing club nights versus what emerges when you sort of like walk blinking into like the bright day after. Like what are the different kinds, what is like night knowledge versus kind of morning knowledge?
Oh my God, I love this question. What is night knowledge versus what is day knowledge? I think on a more like formal level, night and day, or like darkness and light, function as a way to explore her like double life, right? She lies about being Afghan until the end of the novel, and doesn't reveal herself to anyone, really. She lies to her parents about where she goes out because she's kind of from a traditional household, and then also lives a kind of different imagined life within the world of her friends. So truth and lies are manifested within those two different worlds. But I also think that nightlife or the subterranean world of club culture is particularly interesting creatively, because we can explore our subconscious there. And I think there is a scene early on where Marlo, even though he's kind of a pretentious character within the novel, says that that's where you can follow the drives of your id, right? Like you're the most yourself because you're uninhibited, which I think is just interesting to think about within the scope of the novel, especially for someone like Nila, who comes from kind of a repressive household. What does it mean to let go of everything and let go of like reputation and image and follow base desires and like just embody this libidinal energy? And then day knowledge, I think, is the aftermath or the after hours of like, oh, this that the reality can't just exist in this like underbelly, right? Like there have to be rules. There is everything is both, right? Like there is the dialectical tension again between the two, and rules have to be adhered to occasionally, I guess.
Yeah. Well, what a gift for this novel's momentum that it doesn't follow the rules too its characters don't follow the rules too often. Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about that kind of the space of letting go that comes in the night or in the club or in the company of strangers, and then the way that daylight kind of brings back the everything else, self-consciousness, shame, this sort of force field of external expectations, background. I think the question that I wanted to ask about, you can sort of map that tension onto shame and shamelessness, right? Like shamelessness in the club, and then shame kind of arriving with the dawn the next morning, or the kind of crossing back out into the threshold through into the day. There's a line that I looked up because I remembered it had stayed with me from the first time that I had read one of your poems, which I love, a poem called, there are a number of them that I love, but this one is an essay on loss. And I was thinking about it, was kind of rattling around in my own subconscious as I was reading the novel. This one line, when you looked at me, I understood the soul was small as a grape, naked and translucent and without shame. And I wondered how you understand, for Nila, you were speaking earlier about loving the Bildungsroman because it maps change in a character. I wonder for you with Nila, and maybe this is a way of asking what changes for Nila or inside of Nila across the course of this novel. But what's the kind of shifting relationship between shame, letting go of shame, and like building a self? Or discovering a self?
I love that question. I think ultimately it's kind of a collective answer for her, or like an answer that relates to the collective around her, because I'm interested in shame as a literary device in fiction because it's a universal feeling, as you say. It's just like it comes with having self-consciousness, right? Like everyone has the capacity to experience it. It's a moral feeling or a social feeling that we have when we think we have made a mistake. For her to feel shame about her Afghan heritage is interesting because you can explore the interiority of the character, asking, okay, is it just paranoia? Where does it come from? Or is there something external that is triggering this type of shame, through which then you can explore, okay, what is the society around her looking like? And of course, the shame on the one hand comes through being like raised in Germany in a somewhat racist post 9/11 society that is extremely Islamophobic and xenophobic. But then there is also shame as a device, or like as an oppressive method or tool used in order to suppress women in a traditional patriarchal society or culture that she's from. And I was interested in like how solipsistic Nila is about her feeling of shame. She thinks she's the only person experiencing it, that no one, and it's actually not a big deal to be Afghan, right? Like the big reveal doesn't actually include that many problems for her. Most people are just like, well, I don't care, right? It's just like this massive secret that she has amassed. And then again, on the other hand, I think what is changing for her is her understanding of how shame works for the people in her community at large. Not just shame about their heritage, but especially shame and how it functions for the men around her, because she has this moment later in the novel where she looks at a photograph of her father it's a photograph taken in Kabul, where her father and some of his cousins and brothers are sitting on a hill, and they're wearing dismal shawls or keffiyehs, and they're looking down. And one of them is holding a camcorder, but at first she thinks he's holding a rifle. And it's kind of emblemizing her political awakening a little bit, because she suddenly understands what this picture means to her, and also understands herself as part of the people in that picture, right? And why that was important to include, first of all, this is a real photograph that exists in real life, and I didn't want to spend too much time in the book about thinking about like the difference between the rifle and the camcorder, because it seemed cliched, but I still brought it in, at least in one sentence. But her understanding that she's part of the collective is important, and also understanding the shame that the men experience, because the great irony is that while Nila is being shamed by the men in her family, they're being shamed by the German society around them, because as like Muslim men, Afghan men, or men who are read as Arab or somehow Middle Eastern, Turkish, whatever it is in Europe at the time, or even now, have only a very limited room to express themselves in, if they are not, like, if they don't want to be seen as a threat or as a terrorist, right? So it's kind of a moment of like self-castration that they have to go through, which leads a lot of the men in the book to this depressed state. And I think she understands it once she sees that picture. So I think the change that comes is a little bit political as well as artistic for her, and definitely a moment where she understands that she's part of a bigger group.
Yeah, I love that. I love that articulation of the shift in a relationship to a feeling, whether it's a feeling of shame or something else, not as a kind of vanquishing of the feeling or an overcoming or letting go of it, but actually kind of pivoting away from an understanding of that as like, that feeling is like the particular province of one's own soul versus this, you know, as you said, the kind of solipsistic understanding of that feeling towards something that's more communal or collective, or sort of like it's a shared thing. I'm part, this sort of scene inside a photograph of a distant place is actually something I'm part of, I'm already implicated in some way. I'm sure there's so many questions in the room, but I do have, and I could ask you questions all night.
You're so smart. I love your questions.
So much where the night knowledge comes from. But I'm at least going to ask one more, maybe a few. I don't know where we're at with time, but thinking about, you know, when you said you started to write this novel in early 2020 and in some of those pandemic days, I am interested in learning a little bit more about. I feel like every book has a biography, like the sort of story of its making and when it began, how it changed, what other minds kind of became part of its DNA. And I'm endlessly fascinated by revision. One of my favorite lines from one of my favorite books, Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights, is has to do with revision.
I love that book.
One character asks another, there are sleepless nights in your book as well. One character asks another, don't you know that revision can enter the heart like a new love? Which is like kind of a cool, sexy outfit for revision to get to wear. Like revision sometimes the school marmy librarian of the book process world, but I actually think revision is really sexy and strange and surprising, and it can enter the heart like a new love sometimes. But I wonder what changed or evolved for you in this book over the course of revising it. What surprised you as you were revising this book? What did you get wrong about this book when you started out, or not know about the book when you began it that you then came to learn? And what did other readers see in this book along the way that you couldn't, that they helped you to see or to find in it?
I love this question again. I also love revision. It's actually my favorite part of writing. I mean, the first draft is always magical, but it so rarely is the best version of what you write. And this book went through a lot of revisions. And I have to also say that I'm actually very guarded and private with my drafts. I don't know if it's, I don't know what that says about my psyche, but I hate criticism. So no one saw the first draft of this book until I sent it to my agent. So his feedback was what changed most of it. But she, like Nila as a character, now in this version is like an only child, and her mother is dead, and all of these things were not true in the very first iteration. She had kind of a larger family, but I realized that some of the characters that then I had to kill off were too interesting for what I wanted to achieve in this book, and they have to be written about and maybe in other stories or books at some point. They drew, they were just like, they drew too much energy from me, you know, and I found that pretty fascinating in writing fiction as a poet, I guess, that a character can have so many demands, even though I made them up. And I also, initially had a different ending, where now it ends on a happier note that I think is intuitive to me as a writer. You know, I am a European, so I would rather end it in a bleak moment, I think. But she gets out of Berlin, and she ends up having an acceptance to a university in London, which feels like a happy ending to me. So that also changed, but it made the arc of the Bildungsroman clearer. And what I realized while writing this book, and I had to kind of teach myself how to write a novel, was that I really like stories, and I like story arcs in the most basic Aristotelian sense, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, because I feel like I have a kind of novelistic disposition. I lie in my poems all the time, but also I find that narratives seem like a natural way of categorizing time, which feels so chaotic and inchoate, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about, I have a good friend who I just had lunch with the other day, who is a novelist but is working on a nonfiction book for the first time. That's kind of just a book-length essay, and she said she was feeling totally unmoored by having to let go of time as the kind of principal organizing force, which of course in certain kinds of narrative nonfiction it is as well. But that idea of time as a certain ordering container of experience, and also a sort of instigating catalyst. I mean, it can do all those things quite powerfully. And I do have 1,000 questions also about moving from writing poetry to, as you say, teaching yourself how to write a novel. But I maybe will open it up to the room, because I'm sure there are so many questions from all of these loving and rapt faces. And so we'll maybe turn it to the rest of you. You can choose.
Hi, yeah.
I love that this book was set in Berlin. It just felt like it had to be in Berlin. I'm curious about the decision to have Marlo be American, which she also felt like he had to be, but I'm wondering, like, what went through your mind as you were creating that character?
Okay, so the question was about how or why Marlo, who is the love interest in this book for Nila, is an American, because the book is set in Berlin. I was interested in exploring different types of immigrant experience in Berlin at this time in particular. Now Berlin is super international, and you can walk into any cafe or restaurant and just speak English and expect the waiters to speak English. And most of the time, the waiters won't even speak German, right? And depending on the neighborhood. But in 2011, that wasn't yet the case. I was, just interested in having two characters who have opposing experiences of immigration, one of them being the child of refugees, and the other one being an artistic expat, so to say, which is why I made Marlo an American, for whom Berlin is kind of this bohemian utopia of bliss and a cheap life as an artist, but it's not the same for the protagonist. Thank you. Yes.
Hey, so I think about this a lot when it comes to my own writing, and I have read you also touch on it in your poetry. I guess how to navigate or reconcile wanting to draw on your experience as an immigrant or being of a certain culture, while feeling the guilt of, well, what do I know? I wasn't there enough. So navigating that conflict.
Thank you for that question. I don't know. I guess that's why I'm writing. You know, that ultimately being in exile and not having access to many of the stories that I was raised on, because they're just part of my oral, history or whatever, I think is what has compelled me to explore everything that I do in language, be it in poetry or in fiction. But I also think what is extremely important, and I did that in my poetry collection, and it kind of opened it up to me, is to embody that question and allow it to come into the writing. The what do I know can be an interesting point to write from, What do I know and why do I want to know? What is mine, what is not mine? I think that tension is something to write about. You're welcome. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please.
I've kind of had this thesis recently that I think poets make the best novelists. I'm thinking having Aber, Ben Lerner. So I'm kind of curious, what what from your poetry experience could you like bring with you to novel writing, and what do you have to leave behind?
Thank you for that question. The question was, what from my poetry writing could I bring into my novel, and what did I have to leave behind? Well, I think it's easier to write a novel because we live in a world of prose. Almost every text we encounter is in prose, and poetry breaks that rule because it breaks lines, right? So it's harder, I guess, to write poetry rather than the other way around if you're trained as a poet versus as a fiction writer. But I don't. I mean, I think my attention to music, sound, and language, and also sensory detail, because the image is so important as a device in poetry, is something that I definitely brought into the novel. Maybe sometimes to my detriment, because during revision I would, or when copy editors would edit something out that wasn't grammatically correct entirely, I felt really sad because it was the right sound, a particular word. So I had to let go of that for sure, and then I had to teach myself how to maintain tension and a narrative arc in a long form book, which you also don't have to do in poetry because you can just jump around and associate and fly. But yeah, I think that's what I took from it.
Sometimes you have to tell the copy editors that you want to keep it.
I need to learn that. Yes.
How did you teach yourself to maintain a narrative arc over a long time coming from poetry?
I think, okay, thank you for that question. It was about how I taught myself to write a novel, I guess, or maintain narrative tension. I read a lot of novels and kind of mapped them out. A lot of novels that I loved and were some of my favorite books are actually not that good at having a classic novel plot and are more meandering. But once I sat down to write, I realized that I love having a little bit of tension and propulsive energy in the story. And I just mapped them out forensically, to be honest. So I would just analyze why something is exciting to read and where breadcrumbs are in terms of, tension or mystery or whatever, and try to implement that in my own writing. But that's also how I think I try to tell my students when I teach poetry. That's how they should read and teach themselves, because you can't learn everything in a workshop, right? A lot of it you have to teach yourself. So when you really love something and are engrossed by it, the way to figure out why that is and how you can use those tools in your own writing is by analyzing it, really, and then close reading a text. Yeah, thank you. I think there was a question back there. Yes, please.
I'm interested in this, how you said that you started writing this during the pandemic. And I guess that's, almost 5 years ago at this point. So many things change, obviously, like life takes so many turns and whatnot. How does that affect the actual mechanical writing over that period of time? How do you think, if they did it all, like events in your life throughout their change, or events in a writer's life change what they're writing about? Over the course of that period of time, over like in a narrative piece.
Thank you for that question. How did the writing, or like 5 years, change the process of completing this novel, or how did real life bleed into the creative process, I guess? Well, partly the novel is set at a time that's like 15 years ago at this point. When I started writing it, it was a decade prior. And had I had a very contained time frame, so to say, but I think it's pretty much subconscious what informs one's writing and what doesn't, and what you allow to enter and what you push out. There are certain parts in the book that I probably wouldn't write the same way now, because the world has changed a lot since then, but also 5 years, I mean, I didn't stop writing this yesterday, right? The publishing industry is also quite slow in America, I have to say. So the book was finished a couple years ago, and then now it's published. So it is interesting. I think but I am a proponent of allowing life to change what you write, and you do as the author of the book, you do have agency until the very last minute before it goes into print to change something. I think there is a story about Shirley Hazard with The Transit of Venus, or maybe one of her other novels, where she completely changed the ending or the beginning even after the galleys went out to critics. So it's in your hands. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Something you said about appreciating arcs in stories reminded me of how you use time in this novel. You said it in the past tense, and there are moments where you sort of ground the reader by referring to what is happening in the story as if Nila is looking at this from many years later. And I wonder how you made that decision. Was that intuitive? Was that there from the beginning? Or did you come to recognize that this is a useful device to ground this story?
Thank you for that question. I think part of it was intuitive. It's just how the story evolved when I first sat down to write it, that it was an older character looking back. And initially in the very first draft, I had a prelude that also situated the whole story in this more intense kind of flashback moment that contained the story in a point of retrospection. And ultimately, I decided that it would be useful for this narrator, even though I could have just said it in the present tense or taken out the fact that she's older when she's looking back, because I didn't give her so much of a resolution at the end and kind of ended it in medias res, I would say. She doesn't make it actually out of Berlin, right? She just says that she's leaving, so that the reader at least has an understanding that, she has grown up and is not arrested in that development anymore. Anyone else? Okay, one more if there is one. Otherwise we can.
I did actually have, I have lots more, but there was one that just, that I realized I was so eager to ask when you were just speaking just now, which is, if I'm remembering this right, you translated the novel yourself into German from the English. And I'm wondering what emerged for you in that translation process, whether there were things how you feel the novel is a different novel in German, if you do, what kind of emerged more clearly to you in the novel by virtue of translating it into German, and whether there was anything you found yourself wanting to change or changing or inflecting. Just that process was so fascinating to me, and I wanted to be inside of it with you for a minute.
Thank you for that question. The first thing that I learned while translating is that I should never do this again. It was one of the hardest things I've ever attempted and did, I guess. But at least I got it off my bucket list. And the other thing is that it's quite interesting. I don't know what language I prefer the novel in. I think I just love writing in English because it's like a free playground that I can reinvent myself in, and English as a language feels more flexible and malleable, and you can play around more within it syntactically rather than German, which is pretty rigid but then flexible in other ways where you can create compound words that you can't really in English. But some of the music definitely got lost. And I remember my sister, who still lives in Germany, reading an early draft of this book, and she said, "I'm so sad that it won't be the same in German," even before it was clear that I would translate it myself into German, because sound is so important to me. And German is just not as musical of a language, right? Words are like 500 million syllables long, and often quite ugly sounding. So you can't create that much of a beautiful tapestry within it. But that gives it some heft. And then also one thing that I realized within the translation process was that a lot of my colloquial understanding of drug culture actually exists in German and not in English. So some of it is just much more colloquial and funnier in German, and then other parts are not as exciting. Yeah.
I just needed to have some sense of FOMO for what I was missing in the German, but I can stay here with Physicality.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Aria.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much.
everyone who asked questions. Thank you to Leslie for moderating such a great conversation. And thank you, of course, to Aria for celebrating this launch with us. So a few final reminders before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us in the room, we have plenty of additional copies of Good Girl if you didn't already grab yours. We also have some copies of Aria's poetry collection, Hard Damage, which is fantastic. And we have copies of Leslie's most recent memoir, Splinters, which is also fantastic. So I definitely recommend checking both of those out as well. Aria will be around to sign your books. So that's going to be happening. If my coworkers wouldn't mind just pointing right over where, yeah, okay, that's good enough. Right where David is actually standing right now. Thank you, David. So we'll just have you all line up down the center aisle, curve around to the wall, and just give us a minute to get Aria settled back there, and then give her all the love you want. Thank you all again for coming out. Let's give these two one more round of applause.